Okay, we're going to get going. Welcome, everyone. I still see we have a bunch more people who are joining. I'm going to start with just a couple of minutes of intro, and then I will hand it off to Jim. So, Jim, I'll ask you to help me in advance slides for the first couple ones. So, for those of you who haven't attended a session before, my name is Adam Greco and I work for Search Discovery. The Search Discovery education community is a place to get free analytics education for anyone who wants it. We started this program because we wanted to kind of share some knowledge that we have and also bring in some experts from outside of search discovery as well and cover a bunch of topic areas that you see here, especially for those who have been impacted negatively by the current pandemic and might find themselves looking for new jobs. So we always feel like anyone can learn more. So this is a great venue for you to just kind of pick the topics that you want and learn about it. If you did not sign up for topics originally, the ones that you really wanted, or you maybe have changed your mind, if you DM Adam Greco in the Slack group associated with SDEC, I can double check if you are in the right groups. And I can add you if you're not getting invites to sessions for some of the topics that you see here. So next slide. Right now, the SDEC has been growing gangbusters. We just hit a little over 1,600 members, which is great. We're in 66 countries, 561 cities. And in this channel alone, talking about tag management data layers, we're at 1225, which is really cool. We have more capacity. We want this to be used by as many people as possible. So if you have friends or coworkers that want to join, feel free to share the link below, bit.ly/SDI-SDEC, and we can definitely have more people. So feel free to share that link, and we'd love to get more people in the group. Some things that would really help us to help you. Some of you have seen me kind of ping you on Slack. Because this group is getting so big, email is not working as it did in the beginning because a lot of people are getting emails caught in spam filters. So a couple of things you can do is if you join the Slack group, that gives you another way to find out what's going on and communicate with me if you're having any problems. If you can, when you join the Slack group, it really helps us out a lot if you could make your username and your display name your full name, just like first name space last name. That helps us to make sure we get you into the right Slack channels. If you can, in your email client, try to add SDEC@searchdiscovery.com and the general Zoom email address that Zoom sends webinars out to, no reply @zoom.us to your contacts. If you do that, then you can make sure that you get all the webinar invites. If your organization doesn't let you use Zoom, don't worry about it. We've got you covered. Just DM me and I'll add you to a private group where you can have an alternative way to get these webinars. And if you're getting too many emails from me or you signed up for too many topics and I'm spamming you too much and you don't want to get meeting invites and reminders and just look at stuff on Slack, then you can DM me and I will make sure that you don't get as many emails. Next thing, I wanted to share with you the upcoming SDEC webinars. Some of you may not have signed up for all these topic areas, but we've been working really hard to get as much content to you as quickly as possible during this pandemic. So here on the left, you see a bunch of the ones that are coming up. We already have ones going all the way through September. If there's ones here that you want to attend, but you haven't received an invite for, all of the invites for these have gone out except for the one on September 1st for Leah Pica. So if you want to join those and you just DM me and I can add you to that list. And we also have created a shared calendar in Google Calendar that you can see all of the meetings. I'm actually going to add that to the chat right now, just in case you don't have it. So I'm just going to put a link here, but that's a way that you could add a Google Calendar and you could see when the events are taking place. And then one more, as we go through the webinar today, if you have questions that you want Jim to answer either live or after the session, please add them in the Q&A area. Do not add them to the chat. That doesn't work. Please add them to the Q&A area, and we will be recording this, and we will be posting the answers to the questions that we don't get to today afterwards in the Slack channel. So with all that, we are done, and I will hand it off to Jim.
Hey all, I'm Jim Gordon. If you don't know, if you haven't heard of me, or you know, you've haven't heard one of my sessions before, I'm one of the early employees of Search Discovery, and I currently lead the implementation capability here. I helped build Satellite, worked on that, did a lot of selling of Satellite and a lot of implementation. So if any of you were early Satellite users, I might have been your tech support. Satellite turned into DTM, which eventually turned into Launch. I write a lot about analytics on gymalytics.com. And a little bit about me, I love college football, specifically Clemson football, and grilling. So if you follow me on Twitter at gymalytics, you'll see a lot of grilling, maybe not so much college football right now, a lot of analytics. And I hope you all use tools that I built like the DTM or Launch cheat sheet and Tagtician. So I want to talk to you obviously about the event-driven data layer. And what's interesting about it is I've written about it over the last year, and Google Tag Manager has kind of paved the way for event-driven data layers over the last 6 or 7 years. But what's remarkable to me is it hasn't picked up a ton of traction on platforms like Adobe Launch and Helium. What I want to do is talk about how easy it is to implement an event-driven data layer and why you should be using the event-driven data layer. I'm going to go through this and hopefully finish with plenty of time for questions. There is code in this presentation, and I'm going to talk through it. So if you're not super codey, I'm going to try to make it with the voiceover a little bit less intimidating. Whenever we talk about stuff like data layer, it does involve code, but I promise you, it's not gonna get super duper nerdy, because my career path has kind of led me from the business side, and I've backed into the development side, so I know absolutely what it's like to look at stuff and just have my eyes completely glaze over, because I did not start an implementation. So let's talk about this event-driven data layer. And for those who are the uninitiated, what is a data layer? A data layer is a layer of business information that engineers implement on a website to supply data for tags and tag management systems. So what that helps us do is keep data consistent and increase the depth of our data. What it also helps us do is reduce the amount of time that we're spending maintaining our tags within the tag management system. And I put this pie chart here, and I want to shout out to Tim Wilson real quick, because he inspired me to make a pie chart where we have quite a few analytics activities that we do. A big chunk of that is often tag maintenance. And I know a lot of us do reporting, QA, and other stuff. But I often found that a minority of my time, or a very small amount of my time, was spent doing actual analysis. And my goal with this, and my goal with helping evangelize this event-driven data layer, is we can make the slice of the pie for actual analysis a lot larger. Because I don't think it's very productive, especially in this climate, in the unique situation that we are with the pandemic and the global economy being a little volatile. It's not very productive for us to be doing stuff like maintaining tags, because that doesn't necessarily prove our value to the organization. And as analysts, we provide a lot of value. And implementing an event-driven data layer helps bring us closer to that value. And I always joke around with folks when we talk about data layers and implementation and stuff like that. They're like, well, Jim, you lead implementation. Shouldn't you love it? And I do love implementing stuff, but I like implementing sustainable implementations. We're not coal miners. We don't say, I hard-coded tags on Hooli.com the same as my father before me and his father before him. We want to move on, right, from an implementation. We want to take the next step, and that's actually doing stuff with the data. And to do that, I want to use a metaphor. And the metaphor is manufacturing. My background, when I was in college, I majored in industrial engineering. And that's about where my manufacturing history ended. But I did learn a thing or two about manufacturing. And before we had mass production, there was what we called artisanal production. We still have artisans around here. You've been on Etsy. And this method of production is someone places an order, and that order is fulfilled by someone who is individually producing that item. If I wanted a chair, I order a chair, and that person says, okay, I will make you a chair. And that person hammers in the legs in the chair. I don't know how to make chairs, so forgive me. They hammer in the legs of the chair, and then they deliver that individual product specifically for you. Well, that takes time. That's expensive. It's not very scalable. And honestly, the results are going to vary. Because if that person uses a bad piece of wood, or if they're not feeling too well that day, maybe they're hungover and putting together a chair, you might not get the same quality of product. But that's the cost of artisanal production. And in the same vein, if you're not leveraging a data layer, you're running into the same issues. Not using a data layer often isn't the fastest way to do things, often. It's not cheap because you're spending a lot of money maintaining that implementation. It's not scalable because everything is very ad hoc. You're often using more code. You're leveraging CSS selectors, which have a dependency on your site to stay the same. It's not reliable because if your site ever changes, your tags are going to break. You're getting a lot of different line items of data, and it is not modern. It's interesting, when we sold the early tag management systems, we actually, one of our biggest selling points was, implement 2 lines of code. And that's all you need to do, or 1 line of code, or, insert X amount of lines of code. We've all heard that line before. And we're kind of pulling a bait and switch with development teams by saying, well, hey, now we need to implement this data layer. But the upshot is implementing a data layer is a lot less expensive than the alternative, which is not having one. And that's because there is a cost to doing feel-good DIY. And buying artisanal products, I feel good buying artisan-made products in my house, but I'm not going to do the same with my data layer, or with my analytics implementation. So someone asks, hey, Jim, can you implement a pixel that grabs transaction information? Sure, yeah, okay. Well, here's the receipt page where we have an order ID. I'm buying cheese, books, and a chicken. That's what everyone usually buys, right? And the total cost is $42.42. Well, let's see. I'm going to start by doing this codey stuff. I got to loop through these objects and split this stuff up. And hang on a second. I need to add more because I got to pull the product cost. And wait a second. I probably want to reuse some functions. And if your eyes are glazing over and you've ever done implementation, and even if you're a developer and you're like, this isn't the most optimal way of doing it, you can tell how this isn't very sustainable. And crap, I still need to push this stuff into an object and actually package this into a server call to send to my analytics tool. But eventually, after several hours of trial and error, we're all done. And let's take a look at our beautiful data. Wow, this looks real nice. So we have books, Libros, books, pound 039, book, which apparently is German for books. So apologies for anyone who speaks German and I'm misusing it. So when you're scraping from the page, all it does is grab whatever is on the page. And if you're not trimming things properly, if you have differences between singular and plural, if you have different languages, for instance, if I speak Spanish and I'm translating the page locally into Spanish, I'm going to get a lot of different line items. And all of this stuff is basically mental debt that you're paying. You're paying mental debt by having all of these different line items, because now you're going to have to consolidate and you're going to have to answer different questions. Hey, why do you have a separate line item from of libros and books? Aren't they the same thing? Why do we have all these weird characters? So then your time is now spent massaging those reports and then explaining to stakeholders why those are different line items. So our expectations were that we're going to have this beautiful picture, this beautiful cookie. I like cookies, so use this one. But in reality, when you bake it, while you still might have a functional product, it's nowhere close to the way that you intended it. So then we get more requests. Hey, Jim, but where can we find that coupon code? Or, hey, why don't we add, I want a tag to track the stuff that's in my shopping cart. Well, great. I have to create an entirely new engine just to pull the information from the shopping cart. Well, great. When I click on products in my product listings, I'm going to have to create an entire engine for that. And this becomes this house of cards of JavaScript, where if you pull one card out, the whole thing collapses. So eventually I say, oh, I quit. Somebody else deal with it. And that's when the company's like, well, okay, let's pull somebody else in. And then you pull someone else in, and they're not used to the JavaScript. They're not used to the coding patterns that that previous developer had used, because you pulled in someone who's closer to the business because you want to make more decisions. Anyway, it turns into a whole mess. So how do we progress from this artisan style implementation into something a little bit more sustainable? Well, along came the assembly line. And you're all pretty familiar with the assembly line. If you've taken any sort of history course, you've probably read about Ford Motor Company, and they really were excellent at marketing their assembly line. I'm pretty positive they weren't the first. But when the Industrial Revolution came along, assembly lines made our products more consistent. And they made it less expensive, and things were produced faster. And that's because you didn't have artisans producing each of those products. And the metaphor I'm using with assembly lines goes to the W3C data layer, which was created in 2013. The W3C data layer was, was created and last updated in 2013. Was really revolutionary and served its purpose in making the data layer concept mainstream. Now, just because it made it mainstream doesn't necessarily mean it was the best way to do it. Because like the assembly line, the W3C is very fast, it's cheap, and it's relatively scalable. But it's not as reliable and not as modern because we have the human variable in this. The W3C is good up until a certain point. And as our technology, our web technology is modernized, our digital technology is modernized, and introduce stuff like single page apps, and we do all sorts of fancy stuff that requires timing on the page, its scalability has become very, very limited. And so is its reliability. So for instance, it's really straightforward to send this to a developer, say, hey, our page data looks kind of like this. We have this object called digital data with a page, and it has a consistent page ID, destination URL, category. We have our country and language, and we can pull all of this data consistently and not have to worry about language changes, which is fantastic. So when someone comes up to me and says, hey, Jim, can you implement a pixel that grabs transaction information? I can say, yeah, I've got everything I need right here in this digital data object. But then when they approach me and say, hey, so we're building a single page app and want to track some other key actions, well, wait a second. Single page app and track other actions? Well, we're going to have to use a different design pattern for that, because the W3C falls short in that it's very, very difficult to track single page apps, tracking ad hoc events like clicks and anything that requires timing. And what we have to do is deviate from the W3C and leverage other methodologies to track event data, which event data is what I call clicks and stuff. So maybe you're using direct call rules. If you're using Telium, they have something similar. JavaScript events, CSS selectors, object polling. That's like you checking an object to see if it changes, which isn't reliable. Custom engines, or using HTML5 attributes. In all of these, and having worked through hundreds of different implementations, I can say I've seen many implementations that use all 6 of these methodologies, which is insane. These are all different design patterns. And when you're implementing and you're using a lot of different design patterns, that makes your implementation a lot less transferable. Now, unless you're a coal miner and you want your child after you to maintain the implementation just as you have, you want to minimize those design patterns so you can move on to more fulfilling work. So implementation design pattern, when using W3C, we have page load rules, direct call rules, JavaScript events, CSS selectors, object pulling, custom JS, HTML5 attributes. And on top of that, you have other design patterns within Adobe Analytics, like processing rules, Vista rules, sync classifications, auto classifications, and a million other things that I'm most definitely forgetting and that Adam will remind me of after I'm done with this. All of these design patterns make it incredibly challenging to QA our implementation. And that's a problem. And a problem that we solve through robotic assembly. Now, robotic assembly, unlike the assembly line, solves for the variable of the people. Now, we don't get rid of people with an event-driven data layer, but we reduce the variability of someone who might not screw in the widget tight enough on my engine, on my vehicle. Now, I don't know if there are widgets that you screw in on an engine on a vehicle. This is me being totally ignorant of how cars work. But when you add in robots, it makes implementations a lot more consistent. Now, what you're probably thinking is there is upfront cost to a robot. Well, yeah, there's an upfront cost to everything. But long-term, automating a solution, especially using robotic assembly, is a lot less expensive long-term. You get a much more consistent product. The reliability goes up. So it's fast, cheap, scalable, reliable, and modern. Now, we're not buying a $12 million robot with an event-driven data layer. We're using a dev cycle that we would have otherwise used for maybe a W3C data layer historically, but instead we're using this event-driven data layer methodology. Now, let's talk about what this is. Now, if you remember a couple minutes ago, we were talking about different design patterns. Now, for an event-driven data layer, the implementation design pattern is a single point. It's the data layer event. Everything is done through a data layer event. Does that mean you can't mix design patterns? No, of course you can mix design patterns. But everything that's important, we want to drive through this data layer event. So what does that look like? Well, here's the W3C. You might have remembered this from a few slides ago. Now pay attention closely as I convert this from a W3C data layer to an event-driven data layer. Boom. That happened a little bit quickly. I want to slow this down just in case you missed it. W3C, event-driven. Let me go back again. W3C, event-driven. One more time, event-driven. Really, really simple. So if someone says, hey, Jim, can you implement a pixel that grabs transaction information? I'm going to take the same structure that I used for that W3C or whatever structure makes more sense because the W3C is about 10 years old. And I'm going to use a more modern approach and say, okay, well, I'm going to push all this data into my data layer. So if I'm building a single page app and want to track some other key actions, I can do that. I'm going to use the data layer.push for our page loaded. So I can ingest all of that information consistently within my tag management system. We'll go into how we do that in a minute. But I wanted to go through a few more examples because this is just the page information. We had already solved for page information with the W3C, but this is also what it looks like for a single page app. And every screen that loads, we pass this page loaded event. And that tells our tag management system that, hey, we should trigger our rule. We should trigger that tag that says something should happen. Because the event-driven data layer pushes the data into your tag management system, it eliminates race conditions. Now, the W3C is subject to race conditions, and other methodologies are also subject to race conditions. And the way that I look at it is like buying a ticket to a concert in high demand. Remember those when we used to go to public places and watch things with other people? So when I would buy a ticket to a concert, I would check a website in the olden days and just refresh the page. Tickets on sale today, check back later. Refresh, refresh, refresh every 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And if it went on sale a couple minutes after the last time I had refreshed, it could have been sold out by the time that I had refreshed it after that 30 minutes. That's what's called a race condition. It's too late. The second I refresh it, I can't purchase my ticket because it sold out in the gap between the last time I checked for that ticket and right now. The event-driven data layer subscribes to events to eliminate those race conditions. So imagine it like I'm subscribing to a push notification. Tickets are on sale, check back later. I'm going to subscribe for a push notification so it lets me know when tickets go on sale. So right when I get that text saying, hey, tickets are on sale, boom, purchase. Thanks for buying. I don't have to worry about missing out on my favorite concert tickets. And that's how the event-driven data layer works. And it's a much more practical way of measuring data on the website. So you don't have to worry about timing and delaying the page and waiting for the data element change timer to tick over, which checks every 1 second. If you click on something, that happens in a lot less than a second. So you're going to be missing a whole lot of data there. So what does that look like? Well, it's the same thing that we were doing before, digital data.push. And you can name this object whatever you want. So if we're tracking CTA clicks, boom, CTA click, action. We put all of our information there that we're passing into our tag management system. For tracking video views, same thing. Something else happened. Literally anything that we do, it's using the exact same design pattern. And you can pass as much information as you want. So something else happened, and I put this is getting repetitive, and you get the idea. You can pass whatever you want into the data layer using the same design pattern. So when you're explaining this to developers, and when you're explaining this to your analytics colleagues, you are explaining one concept, not 10 different concepts, a single concept. So how does this plug into something like Adobe Launch? Well, I included all three tag management systems here, three major tag management systems. Obviously, there's Untitled as well, which can use the one of these methodologies. But Google Tag Manager pioneered the event-driven data layer. So if you're using Google Tag Manager and you're using a data layer, there's a 99% chance that you're already using an event-driven data layer. You might not necessarily be using it to its full potential, but you are likely using some form of event-driven data layer. Adobe Launch, the easiest way to do it is with Data Layer Manager. We have an extension, so I say we because I represent Search Discovery. There's an extension where you just plug it in, and it is tool agnostic. It's not, you're not using code that is proprietary to Search Discovery. All Data Layer Manager is a conduit and an interface to help you trigger rules when stuff happens on the page. You can also use the Adobe Client Data Layer. And our European friends over in, on the Adobe team, consulting team out there, built out the Adobe Client Data Layer, which is open source on GitHub, which is what you could also use for Telium. Telium doesn't have anything that's native to it. They have similar functions that are similar to direct call rules. But really with an event-driven data layer, one of the biggest benefits is that it is agnostic. I can remove Google Tag Manager and I'm not going to throw JavaScript errors. I can remove Adobe Launch and it's not going to throw JavaScript errors. So that is one of the big benefits of an event-driven data layer. So why you should use an event-driven data layer? You should use it because it's comprehensive. You can do anything that you can do with any other data layer. It's scalable. You can use it on single page apps. You don't have to worry about timing. It's transferable. We're using a single design pattern. It's agnostic. I can use whatever I have in Launch with Google Tag Manager. I can also use it with any other tag management system and likely most other event-driven data layer engines. It's reliable. If you trust your W3C data layer, you're going to trust an event-driven data layer. It's simpler. Like I said, single design pattern. We don't have to train on what the difference is between CSS selectors versus our event-driven data layer code versus HTML5 attributes versus what the W3C is versus what custom JavaScript events are versus what page load rules are versus what direct call rules are. These add complexity, and it's subtle, but adding different design patterns adds a lot of complexity. It's less expensive. Obviously, long-term, there is an upfront cost to any data layer. But long-term, you're spending less because our data is more consistent. Anytime we change the website, we're not having to go back and update our CSS selectors. It's fast. So it's fast in multiple ways. Once you figured out how it works, it's much easier to implement. It's also easier to update rules within Adobe Launch. You're not having to write a ton of JavaScript. And then finally, it's not going anywhere. I hesitate to say that anything is future-proof because I don't think, because everything changes. 10 years ago, I would have said the EDD or the W3C was future-proof. And I think the event-driven data layer is going to stick around for at least another decade, maybe 5 to 10 years. Decades might be a little bit of a stretch, but 5 to 10 years. So it's not going anywhere. And we're standardizing across multiple tag management systems. And finally, here's some helpful resources. I want to get to your questions. So there's my blog post, DLM documentation, Google Tag Manager documentation. When you look back at this, you can copy and paste or type this in. I put this in bit.ly links, so it's not too tricky. So that's what I got about the event-driven data layer. I'm eager to answer any of the questions that you have.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Jim. So we're starting to get questions, but if you have any questions for Jim, please post them in the Q&A area, and we'll start tackling them for the rest of the time that we have left. So Jim, I'll shoot the questions to you. If it's one that's longer that you want to cover more in a written format, just say pass, and we'll get to those.
Cool.
First one. I love event-driven data layers and do not love scraping. However, some web dev teams don't prioritize getting data layers built, hence the scraping. Do you have any suggestions for getting web dev teams to act on the event data layer thing?
Yeah, and I've lived through that so often. I could talk about this for hours. So there are a few methodologies, and during a pandemic when we're all working remote and stuff like that, it can be a little bit more tricky to do this. But the best way that I found to get event-driven data layers prioritized is to build personal accountability with our development team and our engineers. What that means is talking to them more, talking to them in person, having one-on-ones, like helping them understand what you're trying to achieve. There are a lot of factors that go into prioritization. Developer buy-in is one of those factors because they feel the same pain that you feel when you're maintaining an implementation. And the upshot is a lot of them just aren't in your shoes. They're not the ones who are jockeying these CSS selectors and maintaining this JavaScript. And they will show a lot of sympathy when you start building that personal rapport with them and saying, these are the struggles that I'm having, and this is all the time that I'm spending on this. And we all want to get to more meaningful work. And these are the results that I anticipate getting out of this implementation, getting out of the work that you're going to do, because they want their work to be meaningful. And the more we can communicate how meaningful their work is going to be to our jobs and to the organization, the more incentivized they are to what's the word I'm looking for? Advocate for the implementation of the event-driven data layer. That's one method. Another method that I've used is building out a cost spreadsheet. So I have a blog post. I think it's one of the blog posts on my site where I have a Google sheet that has an indexed cost of how much money they save by implementing an event-driven data layer, and money talks. So if you're not able to speak individually with your developers and build that personal rapport with them, then I recommend using the cost methodology, which is long-term, they're getting less value out of you as an analyst, a lot less value out of you as an analyst, and they're spending a lot more money on the implementation by having you jockey a lot of these selectors. And it's theoretical. It's not as black and white, because you're saying, well, I intend to use the time that I'm not doing to, or that I'm not using to maintain this implementation, to conduct more analysis, which adds incremental value, which is incredibly important in a time like this. As analysts, we need to do whatever we can to showcase the impact that we have on our organization. But obviously, speaking to their wallets, saying that long-term they're going to spend a lot more money is helpful. And I'm happy to talk about some other methodologies, because like I said, I could talk about this for hours, but I want to get to a few other questions. But that's a very, very good question, and one that I've had to answer a lot.
Yeah, so Jim, the questions are coming in fast and furious now. So we'll have to probably do shorter answers kind of now, and then you can do longer ones.
Y'all, I'm from Atlanta. I talk.
I know, but okay, next one. What are the best resources for web developers on another team to help them get up to speed on EDDL?
Google Tag Manager documentation is super thorough. I do recommend starting, or you don't have to start there. If you're on the Adobe stack, this is self-promoting, but I do recommend starting on my website. I have a lot of examples. What the bit.ly link prior to that is really helpful. I have demos of how it works. The data layer manager documentation is helpful, but I recommend starting from a high level, and my blog posts are generally relatively high level. You could also look at the Google Tag Manager documentation. That's also very, very helpful, just so they can conceptually understand it.
Yeah, and in the document that we'll share in the Slack group later, maybe Jim, you could put a couple links to stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm also writing based on the FAQ, I'm also going to be writing a blog post that we're going to post on the search discovery site about event-driven data layers. So I'm going to answer all your questions individually on a sheet, and also integrate some of that into the blog post.
Cool. So next one, we have an Adobe person out here. Is Adobe's Alloy.js an alternative method to data layers, or does it make use of data layers, or is it something else altogether?
Alloy.js is, or I think they renamed it to Web SDK or something like that. Alloy leverages data layers. So when we talk about Alloy and XDM and stuff like that, XDM is a schema. And so you would leverage something like an event-driven data layer to pass a schema into to Adobe. Alloy.js is the consolidation of libraries into a single library, which is awesome. I'm super pumped about that, because it drives me nuts having all those different libraries. And a lot of that stuff is basically, we need to pass consistent data server side, and then the server will figure out what to do with that data once it's there. So it does leverage the data layer, yes.
Okay, so the next one is, how exactly does the EDDL on single page apps? I assume they meant, how does that work on single page apps? Do you have to send the data layer push with the click on the link or button, or any other event that changes the content on the page without reloading it? Can you please elaborate a little bit more on this?
Yeah, so you define when it happens. So if I'm using, I know that's a kind of a cop-out answer, so let me get a little bit more specific. If I was in your shoes, I would communicate with the developer when the screen changes and the new screen content appears, trigger the .push function, whether it's digital data.push, data layer.push, app event data.push. So it's not, I would not do it on click, because there are often multiple ways to get to another page. So if you're using React, they use a term called mount. When the screen mounts, that's when is mounted. That's when you would trigger the push function. So when we talk about page views, that's when it happens, and it'll all be driven by that .push. So just be like, but you have to think internally, like, what does a page view mean to me? And 99 times out of 100 times on a single page app, it means when a screen appears. And you can use layman's terms for, like, okay, this is I just want this to trigger when when a new screen shows up, and they'll make it happen.
Okay, next one. Do you have any examples of live sites out in the wild that demonstrate a solid data layer approach?
Yeah, I do. I'm gonna have to get back with you on that because I don't know how many of them want me to call them out like in a positive way, but I don't know if they I'm gonna post some of that in the follow-up.
Okay.
Some examples.
Another question. If you are tracking a lot of stuff on a single page app, the data layer being in essence an array, getting bigger and bigger with every push, and the principle to iterate backwards through all elements to find the value of a variable seems inefficient and slow if you reach 50 or more elements. How do you
Yeah.
handle that?
Oh, totally. There's a function built into Data Layer Manager. So like, let's say it's a single page app. That's when we see the object grow and grow and grow. And there's a way that you can clear the data layer. So like when you go from page A to page B, you can check a box that says reset before a certain value. There are also functions that'll let you reset the data layer at a certain point. Additionally, if you want to leverage the objects in the data layer, you will not have to scan through 50 data layer objects. There's what's called the computed state. So you are leveraging the event-driven data layer just like a JSON object. So you're not actually saying like digital data and then cycling through an array. That's not sustainable, and that requires a lot of codey stuff, and I that gets way too nerdy for me. But you will reference the objects in the data layer just like your typical JSON object. So if it's page.name and you're passing that into one of the array objects, you reference it by saying page.name. And we'll have some examples. So there's some examples in a few of my blog posts that'll show you how it technically connects.
Okay, so I think last question we'll get to here live. For orgs that use the data layer on an ongoing basis, what resources or approaches would you recommend to improve automated functional or end-to-end site testing of EDDL, for example, to ensure it raises and emits the events and data objects expected?
That's a very good question. There are a lot of options out there. Obviously, Observe Point is a great tool. I mean, QA2L, QA tool, Data True. There are a lot of good options out there that kind of do Selenium-esque tests. Something that's a little bit more baked in Data Layer Manager. There is a paid feature because it costs us money to host this stuff. That does automatic validation based on a data schema. So when you're building your data layer, you can put in a schema, and in real time, it will validate the data that's being passed into the tag management system against that schema and proactively let you know when something's up. That's just within Data Layer Manager, and that is one way that's baked into Launch to do it. But obviously, there are third-party tools out there that other third-party tools out there that do a whole lot more than that. But if you're just looking for data layer validation, that's one way to go. Another one is, I guess you could probably build Selenium tests. Scaling that stuff is really tricky, and keeping that stuff maintained is also very, very difficult. But I'll probably write some more about it because I have a lot of thoughts on all of this that I could probably better address on paper.
Yeah, cool. So we are at our time. I know that some people will have to drop off. Jim, if you happen to have a couple more minutes, we could keep taking questions. I just don't know your schedule.
Totally.
So we might keep going. I know some might drop off, but they'll be able to come back and check the recording. So let's go 5 more minutes, and just because we do have a lot of quick questions here. But for those of you who are dropping off, thank you so much for joining. And if you want to catch the questions at the end, feel free to fast forward in the recording that will be in the Slack group. So let's just hit a couple more because we've got a bunch more. Documenting a W3C data layer is a pita, which I assume is pain in the butt.
It's also a delicious bread.
Yes, EDDL seems easy to document. Can you provide any resources for documenting in EDDL?
Yeah, I'd love to. One of my blog posts has an example of it, but I think I could do a better job of providing a more agnostic document that you can take and run with. So I'm going to look into to seeing what kind of document I can build for that. That's agnostic. We have like internal documents at Search Discovery that we use. But I think it's absolute, because I want to get as many people on the EDDL as I can, because I think it's good for the industry. So I think it would be worth releasing some kind of document that other folks can use, like a template or something like that.
Okay. Next one. Do you have any examples of how a JavaScript action triggers the event to push to the data layer?
Oh, a JavaScript action. Okay. Yeah. So, and that's kind of a vague question. And I apologize if I'm misinterpreting it. Maybe it's not. It's a little bit broad. So I'm going to do my best to see if I understand this. So if something's happening in JavaScript, how do we push an event into the data layer? So like something that's happening on the page, let's say click on a thing, click on a widget and do something. Well, what I would do is I would talk to a developer and say, hey, in this JavaScript, can you include this digital data.push function when it does the thing that I want it to do? One of the techniques that I use when implementing a data layer is to not get too technical with it. And we can get too technical. We can get really technical and get into tactics. But my recommendation is always to stick to your business rules. So whether it's happening via JavaScript or whether it's happening via Ajax or whether something's happening via single page app, let's stick to our business rules and communicate with developers based on those business rules. So something's happening, some event's happening via JavaScript. Well, it's happening. Someone's subscribing to something, the page isn't reloading, and like there's some Ajax-y thing going on. We'll talk to a developer and say, hey, when we know that the subscription, when someone successfully subscribed to our email list, trigger this .push function. So my recommendation for that isn't to necessarily get into tactics, but to keep it really, really high level and stick to your business rules. Because if we get too deep into the tactics, we're solutioneering and we could be recommending the wrong thing. Outside of that, if you are the developer, then yeah, you would just drop in the .push function inside whatever JavaScript thingy is happening, I guess. That's for lack of a better word.
Okay, well, I think so. I think that's it. The rest of the questions we will try to answer in written format. So thank you all for joining, especially those 100 of you who stayed towards the end. We look forward to seeing you on a future SDEC session, and look in the Slack group under Tag Management later today for the recording, and then shortly thereafter we will get the questions and answers in there as well. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, or you want other people to join, you can always email us at sdec@searchdiscovery.com, or my email is there as well, adam.greco@searchdiscovery.com. Thanks again for joining, and have a great rest of the week.